The night was heavy with unspoken words, and she stood beneath the quiet rain that fell like whispers from the unseen sky. And she thought she had learned what loneliness truly meant, until he came through the mist with eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth the world had forgotten. And when he reached out, she did not move for fear that the moment would break like fragile glass. Yet his hand brushed hers, and the touch was soft and trembling, and alive in a way she had never known. And in that single instant, something inside her woke, and the rain no longer felt cold, but alive with the rhythm of two hearts finding one another through the silence of a storm. Days passed like dreams that did not end, and the world grew smaller around them, until there was nothing left but breath and heartbeat, and the quiet of their shared space. She had never believed that someone could see her so completely and not turn away. Yet he looked at her as though she were the only light left in a dark and endless night. He spoke without words with every look, and she answered in kind with every step and every breath they took together. Each glance a promise, each touch a question that neither dared to answer for fear of how deep it might go. But the warmth that grew between them was not the kind that faded. It was a fire that lived under the skin, and every time he brushed against her, she felt it growing brighter and wilder, until she no longer knew where she ended and he began. Aha, there we go. End of night. They stood beneath the old tree on the edge of the quiet field, where the world felt as if it was holding its breath, and the wind carried the scent of rain and earth and memory. She wanted to tell him everything that her heart had carried, all the wounds and all the waiting. But his eyes stopped her, and in them she saw the answer. He did not need words, because his hand found hers, and the warmth of his skin spoke louder than anything she could ever say. She felt his heartbeat through his fingertips, and it was aha, steady and strong, and it called to her like the sound of home. She closed her eyes and let the fire inside her breathe, and she realized that love was not a flame that burned to destroy, but one that lit the darkness, so two souls could find their way through it. The night fell again, and the stars watched in stillness as they stood together, wrapped in the quiet after every storm that had ever touched their lives. She thought of all the times she had been afraid to feel, afraid to trust, afraid to be seen. But now, standing beside him, she understood that the fire he gave her was not to consume, but to warm, to guide, to remind her that she was alive, and so was he, and that together they were something more than they could ever be apart. He touched her like she was fire, and she burned willingly, not with pain, but with life and love and endless light. And as the wind carried the last whisper of night across the open field, she knew that no matter what worlds might change, no matter what tomorrows might bring, the glow between them would never fade. Morning rose like a soft breath over the quiet hills, and the world was washed in gold and pale silver. She woke to the sound of his heartbeat near her, the rhythm steady, like the song she had always searched for in her dreams. And she watched the light trace the edge of his face, and she thought how strange it was that something as fierce as love could feel this gentle. She reached out her hand and let her fingers rest against his chest, feeling the warmth that lived beneath his skin. The same warmth that had once frightened her with its depth, but now it felt like home. Whispered his name, not to call him, but to keep the sound safe. And he stirred and smiled without opening his eyes. and she knew that even silence had learned how to speak between them. Paris. They walked together through the quiet forest, where sunlight slipped between the leaves, in thin bands of light, like threads of memory. She spoke of her fears, of the things she could not promise, and he listened without breaking her flow, his presence steady like the ground beneath her feet. She told him that love felt too large for her, too wild to be held, but he only took her hand and said nothing. And somehow that said everything. She realized that love was not something that asked to be controlled. It was something that lived and breathed beside you, growing stronger the more you let it be free. They stood still as the world turned, and she felt the wind brush her hair like a soft reminder that forever was not a measure of time, but a moment. Way of being seen. When night came again, they found themselves at the edge of the old field where they had first met. The air was heavy with memory, and the stars were quiet witnesses to everything that had passed. She turned to him and asked, "What if the world ends tomorrow?" And he smiled with the calmness of someone who had already found his eternity, and said, "Then let it end here, where I can still hold you." She felt tears rise, but they were not from sadness. They were born of something deeper, something that lived between the spaces of each heartbeat. She realized that the fire they had built was not a blaze that demanded to burn. It was a living thing that knew when to rest and when to rise. And she leaned into him, letting the warmth wrap around her like the promise of dawn. There came a night when the winds grew cold and the world seemed to fold into silence. She stood alone by the window, watching the stars drift through the endless dark. And for a moment, she feared the quiet without him beside her. But then she closed her eyes and felt the warmth still there in her chest, not fading, not lost, but alive. His touch had never left her. It had written itself into the very pulse of her being. She understood then that love does not vanish when distance grows. It travels in the spaces between breaths. It hides in the glow of every small kindness, and every remembered smile. She stepped outside into the dark and felt the air wrap around her like an old friend. And she whispered into the night that she would keep burning, not for him, but with him. For they were one fire, split between two souls, and no distance, no silence, and no ending could ever turn that flame cold.